Hi again, it's George. It's Professor Streeter. I'm going to be quick here and just make a few remarks about some of the remaining slides from the week 1 slideshow that I presented today in class. Let me again go to the bottom of the screen and present slides. So we talked about the big questions, okay, and what are some of the basic assumptions that we make in beginning to think about these questions. Right, here's a link to the introduction to Schaefer-Landau, The Fundamentals of Ethics, on page 6. He has a list of what he calls reasonable constraints for thinking about the ethical question. How should one live, and everything that comes out of that question. Here's just kind of a list. He constructs sort of starting points for doing ethical reflections, or basic assumptions that we make. Not that we can't question them, but they're assumptions that most of us make. That, for example, justice is a very important moral good. We may disagree about what justice is and how to define it and what kind of a moral good it is and how important it is, but that justice is important from an ethical or moral point of view is something we tend to assume. That equals ought to be treated equally. That's a kind of basic starting point for ethical reflection, something we take for granted. How to define equality and how to interpret that claim is another question. But it's hard to defend an ethical point of view in which we don't sort of commit ourselves to the belief that equals ought to be treated equally, or that might doesn't make right. So look at those starting points or reasonable constraints or plausible assumptions that Schaefer-Landau lists on page 6 and see what you think. Okay, once we begin asking the question, the ethical question, right, there's some basic topics that we can consider. Values is one of them, okay? What are the things we value? What makes life worth living? Here are some questions that kind of come under the broad topic of values. What's worth caring about for its own sake? Pleasure, justice, equality, happiness, freedom, right? There are different types of good that we pursue, different types of things that we value. How do we differentiate them? How are they related to each other? We desire pleasure and freedom. Sometimes they can conflict. So what do we do when our values or the goods that we're seeking in life conflict with each other? And sort of what's the most basic or fundamental good, right? If what we're seeking is to live a good life, right, what is the most basic or fundamental value in life? Okay, so that's one kind of question, right? Is there one unifying good that we're all seeking, that kind of some one highest good that unifies everything else that we desire, like happiness, right? Or are there conflicting goods or conflicting values that maybe in the end can't be fully harmonized? Think about that kind of question, right? Of all the things that we desire, can we harmonize our desires for those things, or do we have to make choices, right? Another way of asking that question, is the good life that we're seeking really attainable? Can we harmonize all of the things that we desire, all the things that we value in a unified life, right? What are some of the obstacles to achieving a good life, right? To unifying the conflicts, or harmonizing the conflicts between different values, different goods that we're seeking, okay? Those are sort of big questions within the topic of value. Think about value statements. Prairie State College makes a value statement. These are our core values, okay? I don't know if you make a personal value statement for your life, but institutions do this. Think about the point of this. Like, why do institutions like Prairie State College make value statements? What's that about? What are they trying to commit themselves to? Right? Is the ideal that they're setting for themselves, is it attainable? Presumably all of these values could harmonize with each other. There aren't any internal conflicts. Okay, but sometimes we see conflicts between our core values, and we have to kind of, again, make choices, make sacrifices. Ideally, like, a value statement is one that is consistent, where all the things that we value harmonize with each other and depend on each other. Think about the way the value of learning relates to the value of respect, right? They're not independent of each other. Okay. Another big question, another big topic, is, questions about the self. The nature of the self, our responsibilities to ourselves, how we understand what we are, who we are, how we discover and constitute our identity as people, as individuals. And that relates to the question of what we want, right? And what we need to thrive. In order to answer the question, what I want, what I need to know what I am and who I am and what my interests are and what's in my best interest. So, right, we'll think about self-interest and the nature of the self and the interest of the self. That ties into questions about character, about the kind of person that I want to become. Okay, don't want to get, when I think about my interest and what it means to promote my self-interest, well, part of that is, I want to be a certain kind of person, right? I want to develop a certain kind of character. I care about who I am. And that's an achievement, right? You're not born with a certain character. You develop it, you build it, you cultivate it over time. So what kinds of traits, what kinds of qualities, what kinds of habits do I want to cultivate in my life, or should I cultivate? That's a question about, that falls under the topic of character, right? Character ethics. And those are some questions that relate to character. We can also think about our responsibility to other people, not just our responsibility to ourselves, and our commitment to promoting our own self-interest and cultivating a good character. But what part of ethics is thinking about other people, okay? And our relationship to humanity. Who is my neighbor? That's the slide that I began with, the Good Samaritan at the beginning of this slideshow. How do I identify my neighbor, right? What interests do we share? What interests do I share with my neighbor? Where are the conflicts, right? A lot of ethical problems emerge when the interest of the self conflicts with the interest of others, right? Or private interest conflicts with public interest, okay? So what do we owe each other as human beings? That ties into questions about community, right? The ethics of community, community building, right? There is no individual without a community. So what binds individuals together? What constitutes the public good as opposed to the private good of individuals? And this leads into questions about justice and equity, right? What makes a society more or less just, more or less equitable, equal, okay? All right, so one other big topic, okay, has to do with what's called morality, right? Ethics raises the big question, how should one live? And part of that question leads to thought about specific actions that we take, specific choices that we make. Okay, so why do we do what we do? Okay, are we always motivated by self-interest, by a desire to promote the interest of the self? Is that what always motivates us? Or do we have specifically moral reasons to act, right? So when I see the stranger on the side of the road, do I only help him because it serves my interest? Or do I do it because it's the morally right thing to do, right? Do we have special moral reasons to do things? And is it possible to act on those reasons? Or are we always just motivated by self-interest? And then if there are moral reasons to act, like to help the stranger on the side of the road, well, does that reason always override other kinds of considerations of self-interest? And then some of you asked about, are we going to learn about the difference between right and wrong? Well, we'll look at what kinds of rules and principles may be governing our decisions. And think about that. Like, do we have basic rules and principles that are governing our decisions? How do they explain the difference between right and wrong, if they do? And why do they apply to us? Why should I think that these rules have authority over me or apply to me in some way, right? Where do these rules come from? Why should I care about moral rules, right? That's a kind of question we'll think about this semester. Okay, so I want to end there. In the classroom, we talked a little bit about how to read philosophy, and I pointed you in the direction of the chapter on hedonism, but you can also look at chapter 2, just the Experience Machine by Nozick, and look, it's very short, a few pages. What do you notice about how the book is edited and formatted, right? Study the table of contents carefully. Pay attention to the discussion questions at the end of each chapter. We talked about this in class. And read for argument structure. Right? What I'm asking you to read for is what's the main conclusion? How does the author support that conclusion by the premises? Like, what assumptions and what basic claims does the author make, or evidence does the author give to support the conclusion? Okay. And so we talked about arguments. We'll come back to that next week, but these last two slides kind of give you a sense of like what I'm talking about when I'm talking about an argument, right? when you're reading the piece by Nozick, The Experience Machine, or any of the readings, look for the argument structure if you can find it. What's the main conclusion? How does the author support that conclusion? Okay. All right, that's it. I'm gonna leave it there, and we will connect up again next week. Okay, bye.